searching history for buried classics. This is Lost Treasures of Gaming.
Welcome back to another episode of Lost Treasures of Gaming, and we have an awesome Lost Treasure for you this week. I am one of your hosts, Sean Evans, otherwise known as Zion Tane.
And I'm also one of your hosts, Sid Bolton, otherwise known as Dirk the Daring, and of course, I'm your gaming archaeologist during the OMG Hour.
Yes, you are, and what have you dug up for us this week, Sid?
Well, you know, we recently did a Lost Treasure for a classic Commodore 64 game for us, for you and I. For other people, they might have played it on other platforms. But it's a game called Montezuma's Revenge, and before you think that maybe it has something to do with drinking water in Mexico, it's not.
No.
It's actually a really cool platforming game that came out in around 1983 or so, and we've got the original programmer here to talk about it.
We do, and you know, I remember this game a lot. You know, there's a lot of games I played on the Commodore 64. You know, I mean, I could go through a list of all of them. But it was last week. That's exactly what I was doing. I was going through a list of all the Commodore 64 games, which you can find on Wikipedia, and I came across Montezuma's Revenge. I'm like, oh man, how could I ever forget about that game? It was so good. I played it all the time. I don't know if I ever finished it, but I played it a lot.
And you know, it's why it's perfect for a Lost Treasure, because it's one of those games that unfortunately came out around the time of the video game Crash, and so maybe didn't get quite the attention it deserved, although it was popular at the time. Really hasn't, I mean, there's kind of been some sequels, and we'll talk about that, but it's certainly a franchise that isn't front and center today. And so, you know, here we are 30 years plus later, and you know, still playing the game, still thinking about the game once we're sort of reminded about it. So It truly qualifies as being a lost treasure, so we'd like to bring a little more attention to it.
Absolutely. And of course, the original creator of Montezuma's Revenge is Robert Yeager, and we're going to talk to him right now. Rob, thank you for joining Lost Treasures of Gaming tonight.
Thanks for having me.
I have to tell you that Montezuma's Revenge is a game that I have very fond memories of from my Commodore 64 days. Grew up on that game, so thank you for making the game.
Well, thank you. I'm always amazed that people remember the game.
I do very fondly. I mean, there's few games that I grew up on that I played all the time, and that was one of them. So.
I played it as well, and mostly on the Commodore 64, but I do have copies of it, of course, in my collection for ColecoVision, Atari 8-bit, 5200, and the Sega Master System version as well. So I have quite a few, not all of the versions, and I must have the 2600 version too.
I always felt that Parker Brothers did a very good job of keeping the gameplay consistent, and really, you know, that the Commodore 64 version and the original version, which was the Atari 800 version, they all have the same feel. You know, they're all really, really good. Even the 2600 version, which was so limited in resources, they really did a fine job with that one too.
Can you take us back to, I guess, around the time when you started creating this? Give us a bit of background on how you got into game programming and what kind of led up to Montezuma's Revenge?
Yeah, sure. I started very young. I was 11 years old when I started to teach myself computer programming, and that was with the Bally Astrocade. I'm sure you guys remember that system.
Yeah, I still have one. Yeah.
That was my first system, and I urged my father to get that one for me because it had the Bally Basic cartridge. So it was the incredibly innovative, amazing system for its time. It really doesn't get the attention that it deserved as being a real, way ahead of its time kind of system. So that was back in like 1978 or so that they had the basic cartridge, and I knew from a really young age that I wanted to be a game developer. There was really nothing else. There was nothing else on my mind. I mean, just playing games and creating games. So I was 11 when I was programming in Bally Basic, and what I was doing at that point when I first started was I was writing basic clones of various arcade games of the time. And I think one or two of them got published in some of those fanzines. And that's really how I got started. I started with Bally Basic, and of course, we had the ability to program in machine language on that system too. It was a Z80 chip, and I learned how to program the Z80 and do hybrid basic machine language programming on the Bally Astrocade. And some of those games were very good. I mean, you know, the games, not just my games, I'm just saying that the platform itself was just very good for developing I mean, it really was something of a homebrew system back then, because a lot of the users were, developing their own little games, and they had the fanzines and they were published, and it was something of a network. And of course, that became very commonplace later as far as user groups and, people creating homebrew games. But the Bally Astrocade was the beginning, and then I got the Atari 800 computer, which was just leaps and bounds beyond anything I had before that, and I started off really like most of the young developers, where I was basically a hacker in the sense that in the good sense, just spending as much time as possible, taking the hardware apart and figuring out how everything worked. And what led up to, I'm trying to try to recall exactly the sequence of events. We at the time when I created Montezuma's Revenge, I already had a few commercial products out at that time that were very, very, very derivative, basically clones of arcade games with little unique qualities to it. My first commercial product was a game called Chomper, which was a Pac-Man clone. It was actually something of a cross between Pac-Man and there was a game by Exidy. What was it called? Zarg. It was a real flop of the game, but it was basically a grid, like you drove a spaceship through a grid. And so my Pac-Man game was more of a grid-like Pac-Man.
Okay.
A Chomper, but it was actually kind of cool because it was probably the first Pac-Man clone of the time. It got rejected from the Atari Programmers Exchange, if you guys remember that. Remember the Atari Programmers Exchange?
I don't, but Sid probably would. Sid is having difficulties tonight, so we have lost him off the call. Hopefully we'll get him back.
I'm rambling on here, Renee, but you were sitting in there.
That's okay. We'll get him back, hopefully.
Why don't I talk, while you're getting him back, I'll talk a little bit about the Atari Program Exchange.
Sure.
What that was an effort by Atari to get the people who used their computers and who were just, developers, just people learning programming on their own, allowed them to publish. It facilitated publishing, game publishing. And everyone knew the Atari Programmer Exchange games weren't as high quality as, the Atari games, but they weren't as expensive either. And Atari promoted this, and they had a competition where there was a first prize was I think $25,000. I mean, that was an unbelievable amount back then.
That's a lot of money. Still is.
Yeah. And then, of course, I wanted to win one of those with incredible cash prizes. And it was very disappointing to be rejected by them. But they wrote me a nice letter kind of saying, hey, kid, you got talent, but, we can't publish a Pac-Man clone on the Atari Programmers Exchange. It's just not going to happen.
So was Chomper just like literally a clone, or did you try to do something different with it?
No, there were a couple things different in the sense that the maze was more of a grid-like shape, and the bad guys were aliens. And there were a couple little differences here and there, but it was very much a Pac-Man style game. There was no denying that. And I also, I mean, I look back at it and people ask me, why would you clone game? Back then, everyone was doing this. The copyright laws, like no one really knew them, and software as a home software was such a new thing.
Right.
There were so many companies. I mean, think about it. Even you remember Jawbreaker, of course. That was a phenomenal Pac-Man clone, but that was published by the company that became Sierra Online. And there was a phenomenal Galaxian clone called Galactic Chase.
Well, it's also how you learn, right? You take something and you try to recreate it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it is a form of flattery, but when I was a kid and I was doing these things, I mean, it was the furthest thing from my mind that I was ripping someone off. It's like the whole. It took a while for me to realize, it was, I shouldn't have done that. It wasn't. But I did, I always said, when I want to do an original something, and Montezuma was really my first real original game, but that also is derivative. I mean, I'm very quick to credit, there were many games that I felt inspired Montezuma's Revenge, including Atari 2600 Superman, an adventure. Both of those games were nonlinear and were very much the beginning of the genre of the actual action adventure genre. And also, of course, Mario. Of course. You can't. Any man who climbs ladders and jumps. It's you're inspired by Mario, and there's no one. You always got to give Mario the credit he deserves.
Well, you certainly weren't. Montezuma's Revenge still has its own feel to it. It may be like a combination of several games that you played at the time, but it definitely has its own feel to it.
Yeah, thanks. And I that is something that I was really going for, a feel. That's the back in those days. It's like every game kind of had its own feel, and almost in that crazy period between like 1978 and 1984. I mean, Montezuma got in just really before the collapse, the first, big game crash. So, like during those years, almost every game was its own genre. It was really an amazing time It was a great time to be alive, a great time to be a kid, and it was an incredibly exciting time, to be part of the whole arcade thing, and seeing these coin-operated games that were just absolutely amazing.
Now, some changes were made to the game, though, right, from the way you had originally conceived of it. And so I guess one of those things, it's like you got to experience very early on the changes that a publisher makes to a developer as they go along. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what happened?
Yeah. Well, in this case, the edits that were done to Montezuma were done to squeeze the game into a cartridge. That was really the whole point. When I originally wrote Montezuma, I had a loaded Atari 800 with 48K RAM. And I also had a disk drive, of course. And the vast majority of the market was either if they had storage, it was the cassette drive. And most of them were 16K systems, and there were even 8K Atari 400 systems. So when Parker Brothers acquired the product or licensed the product, they wanted to get they wanted to saturate the market, and they edited down the game. Now, when I was developing the original Montezuma, it's most people who remember Montezuma, or certainly for the Atari computer, remember my original demo, because my original demo, sure enough, did eventually, escape, I guess, from Parker Brothers, and made it out to the pirate boards. And the game itself made it out to the pirate boards probably maybe a month or two before the actual release of the game. So, it spread like wildfire. And the vast majority of the people who have played Montezuma's Revenge on the Atari didn't pay for it. But I mean, that's how things were back then, you know. And I was pirating too. Everyone was kind of doing that, and I expected it.
Yeah.
But as far as the edits, I can tell you the difference. The original game had a really cool attract mode. You know what I mean by attract mode. In the arcade pieces, just something to attract you to come put a coin in. Of course, we don't need to do that on a computer game, but it's fun to do that. You know, it's kind of a demo, so you can just kind of, or if it's in a store or something, you just have a repeating cycle. And it spelled out the word Montezuma in script. And then it was very much, that introduction was a bit inspired by the attract mode of the game Defender, where it spelled out the name, the word Defender. That was a bit of an inspiration for that. But also the original Montezuma had a bat. The bat was a timer. So if you spend too long in a room, a bat would come out of one of the entrances and he would take you away.
Oh.
So they clipped out the bat, and also, I mean, one of the main things, and I'm sure you guys will want to get into this, the Montezuma's Revenge was never finished. I never finished the game. I was working on a really cool boss, and it was kind of halfway done. And the guys at Parker Brothers said, don't even bother. We have to cut this whole boss out. Like we don't have room for it. Don't even bother finishing it. And at the time, you know, I'm 17 years old and I'm driving a new car and I'm like, oh, okay, I don't have to work. All right. That's fine. I get to just spend the money now. Okay. I can deal with that. So the game itself never actually was finished because I was working on the boss, and the boss is incomplete. So all the people who played the demo, which is the most famous version of the game, you know, talk about, is it possible to beat the boss? No, you cannot beat that boss. It cannot be done. The boss stomps his foot, the whole thing shakes, and you have to be in the air at that moment when the whole pyramid shakes, or else you die. So you have to time jumps based on the boss's dance. It was, I had something pretty elaborate in mind for that boss, and I never, to this day, it was never finished.
Wow. So you can never actually finish the game.
Not the original demo.
Not that version.
Original demo was never, but even the main Montezuma, but back then, games weren't really designed to be finished. That really was the crossover into the adventure when it became a goal, something that actually is completed. I did want Montezuma to be of the spirit of the old coin-op games where it's an infinity thing. It basically, you could go on forever and it just continues to get more difficult, and it should always be possible to complete, to go on forever. Like instead of having a completion, a good player should be able to play infinitely. And that was the spirit of the older games.
Yeah. So how in whatever year it was, 83, how does a 16-year-old get a game purchased by Parker Brothers?
A good question. I had no idea, and I certainly knew nothing about business. But what we did, after I mentioned Chomper, which was my Pac-Man clone, that I actually sold that or licensed that to a tiny little local publisher, and the game that I made after that was a clone of the arcade game Kickman. It was called Pinhead, and similar to Chomper, where anyone can see, like, you look at the game, yeah, it's obviously a Kickman game. But it was not an exact clone. There were things about it different, and what I did, I was into kind of creating a little humor in the game. There's a point in Pinhead where the guy on the unicycle, where Pac-Man comes out and eats the guy on the unicycle. That was one of the intermission shows. Like, Pac-Man comes out, he looks up, a question mark is above his head, like, who's that guy? And then Pac-Man comes down and eats him. So, I just kind of did all kinds of little things like that. It was a fun game. Kickman, Pinhead was probably the only Kickman clone, because Kickman was not a popular arcade game at all.
We actually have this game at the Computer Museum, have the original art. It's actually very Interesting. The art, the clown is very creepy. If you don't like clowns, you don't want to see this art.
Very creepy.
And we have it on cassette. Was it only on cassette?
Oh, how cool! So you're saying the original? Oh, are you talking about
Pinhead.
my game? Oh,
Yeah,
you actually have
yeah.
you actually have a Pinhead. Oh, no
Yeah,
kidding.
I'll send you the link to our website where
Oh.
it says Utopia Software. Yeah, we actually have the original.
that was my company.
Yeah.
So I had this. My father was tremendous help. I mean, tremendous inspiration, and he was a businessman, and he kind of set me up in business when I was about 15 years old. And he did. I mean, I'm saying he set me up. I mean, he did an unbelievable amount of work too. So we were actually manufacturing and selling those Pinhead cartridges and producing it and everything. So we were doing everything, and that was not that uncommon back then. You know, there were a lot of these little independent shops, mom and pop type shops.
Now, according to what we know about your company, and I'm glad that I've got you here so I can ask you, it mentions that Crossfire Canyon was an unreleased Commodore 64 title.
Yes.
So what happened with Crossfire Canyon?
Crossfire Canyon. Well, that had to do with bad timing, as far as it coming out at the worst possible moment, the low point of the first game crash in the mid '80s. Things changed so drastically. That crash. I mean, that was such a devastating crash in the business where. Back when Montezuma first came out, I remember the Consumer Electronics Show, and it's kind of being a kid and being like a superstar and being treated like so like such a special, incredible thing that I was doing. And then 2 years later, I couldn't even get an appointment with these companies because they're like, well, we're not making any new games, and in fact, all we're doing is we forget about it. The game business is over. It was a fad. So many companies, Parker Brothers, just keep in mind, Parker Brothers was a leader in the industry. They went from, being a leader in the industry in 1 year and then the next year saying, no one can make money doing this anymore. And they just shut down their entire operation. So many companies did this. I first really became aware of the fact that the market crashed. I ran into Arnie Katz from Electronic Games Magazine, which was really you guys remember Electronic Games Magazine?
Love that magazine.
Everyone loved that magazine. It was the greatest magazine. I mean, it was I looked forward to that magazine. It was exciting to get that in the mailbox, I remember running into Arnie and say, "Hey, how are things?" So he says to me, "Well, Electronic Games businesses closed their doors, and it looks like the business is more or less done." I'm like, "Are you kidding me?" And I'm like, I thought he was joking around. He goes, "No." He goes, how can that be? I'm thinking a couple months ago, I was at a party at Electronic Games Magazine. There must have been 300 people there. They had a prototype of Dragon's Lair, coin-operated game, and it was so much fun, and it was just like, being on the top of the world. And then within less than a year, totally done. So Crossfire Canyon, I couldn't get it published. There were companies that were willing to do it on spec, but at this point I was kind of I felt I was kind of important, and I felt that I should be able to get a contract with a guarantee in advance, the way the business normally works. But the business was so depressed, the game never got published. I did not create the original Crossfire Canyon. That was actually created by a friend of mine named Dave Sullivan, who created it on the VIC-20. And I saw the game, I liked it a lot, and I said, I want to make this better, good graphics, better gameplay, move it up to the Commodore 64, because that's what I was working on at the time. So this was actually a Commodore 64 game. If you'd like, I don't know if this is available anywhere, I have actual art for the box of Crossfire Canyon. Because keep in mind, originally we were planning on producing it ourselves. If we couldn't get a publisher, and just everything really went to hell in the mid-'80s as far as games. And Crossfire Canyon was a good, fun game, but the problem was it was definitely an old-style game. It was an arcade-style game. And at this point, when the game market collapsed, games really changed. People were convinced people just didn't want those types of games anymore. Then people, the industry was like mad at arcade-style games. it was a difficult time. But Crossfire Canyon was a very fun game, and it's a shame that I may have a disc somewhere. You know.
Well, I'll talk to you about that in another conversation because I'd be very interested in finding out more about it. I know that it's something we put on the website. We know, we've done some research on you and your other games. So, and I've sent you the link so you can take a look at those, elsewhere. But getting back to, of course, Montezuma's Revenge, one of the other questions I had for you was, so we were talking about the changes that the publisher made. They had taken the game and made it smaller. There was also, I believe, a character name change. What happened with Pedro?
They decided to change the name of the Pedro. They originally changed it to Panama Jack. Pedro, you're dealing with, it was my first time dealing with a really, big company, Parker Brothers, big legal department. And they realized there was another Pedro, another Mexican character named Pedro, and they didn't want anyone's toes. Nothing to do with video games, nothing to do with anything. They just wanted to, be safe. But they also, I never really discussed this in an interview because overall I've had a really phenomenal experience with Parker Brothers. But quite frankly, they did do something. They wound up trademarking the name Panama Joe. Now, I always owned Montezuma's Revenge. I licensed it to Parker Brothers. So what they did something of a shady thing by licensing the character and then creating a sequel that they were probably going to cut me out of entirely called, Panama Joe's Adventure Somewhere. And, they were going to pretty much, because they had the trademark of the name, they were going to, try to make a brand based on, rather than on the name Montezuma's Revenge, they would use their, what they considered their intellectual property. But of course, the market went to hell, and the sequel that they did in fact start, I don't know if any prototypes of that. There was a sequel that they were working on, and of course they told me very little about it because of what I just told you. But I know there may be somewhere on this internet there may be a prototype of that out there. I don't know. I don't think I've ever seen it though.
So I'm not sure if you actually finished your story of how Parker Brothers got involved or how you got involved.
No, actually, I got sidetracked. I'm rambling so much. Yes. Okay. So I had Pinhead, and we were selling Pinhead, and we were doing, it wasn't big money, but it was people were interested. It was a good game for the Atari, and I had the prototype. At this point, I'm working on Montezuma, and I had the prototype of Montezuma, and I realized Montezuma was the future of games, and the way was just my first original real game. And because we were in the business, and we wanted exposure and we wanted to sell product, of course, we wound up getting a booth at the Consumer Electronics Show. Now, when I say a booth at the Consumer Electronics Show, now I'm sure the listeners might not be aware, E3 is the successor of the Consumer Electronics Show I think the Consumer Electronics Show may still exist, but at back then, because the video game business, wasn't mature, it was part of the Consumer Electronics Show, and that's where the business took place.
Yeah, CES is usually the one that happens in Vegas first week of January, if that's the same show.
It is, but back then it was in Chicago.
Okay. Yeah. I actually went to it when it was in Chicago many times.
So what we did is, when I say a booth, we couldn't afford a real booth. I mean, we were broke.
Yeah, a table.
No, we had half a table. We shared half a table with guys who sold blank VHS tapes. Okay? So we weren't even in the right area. We were in the VHS area, so we were right in like the porno area, all the porn actors and were coming over and checking out the games, and it was really, really weird. So we were showing games kind of in the porn area of the Consumer Electronics Show.
Now come on, admit it. 16 years old. You're out there, porn area.
I thought I'm 16 years old, and I was absolutely impressed to this day. One of my favorite stories is when I met John Holmes and Ron Jeremy together, and they asked if I had batteries. You imagine the beginning of, before the doors open in the show, everyone's scrambling. Everyone needs an extension cord, this, that, whatever it is. Everyone's going around asking everyone. And then I had John Holmes and Ron Jeremy together, and I met them. And so we were there, and we had two computers set up, one showing Pinhead and one showing Montezuma's Revenge. And at the time, a couple people, lots of people came. There was a buzz about this Montezuma's Revenge game that's over at in the other building. So people were coming over. So we had guys from Parker Brothers coming over, and me and my father were looking at each other. We're looking at name tags and, seeing more and more people from Parker Brothers coming over to look at Montezuma's Revenge. So they wound up taking us out to dinner, and I wound up meeting a lot of very interesting, developers, a lot of the technical people that were working over there, and it was it was an amazing experience for me. And Parker Brothers explained, a game like this deserves worldwide distribution, deserves marketing dollars. They made a very nice case for themselves, and we wound up going with them. There were other companies interested in it. In fact, it's funny. Just this week, I sold something on eBay, which was a gift to me by someone from Adventure. Scott Adams. I guess it was Adventure International. I think they called it at the time. They were interested in Montezuma, so they gave me the autographed Adventure set that's been basically in my bedroom at my parents' house for the last 40 years. So I recently sold that on eBay. They were interested in Montezuma, and there were a couple other companies too, but Parker was the one that we went with, and they wanted to make the cartridge. They were convinced at the time that cartridges, the main reason was cut down on piracy. They felt that cartridges couldn't be copied. And at the time, guys like us knew, well, you can copy a cartridge. It's not that difficult to do. In fact, I even wrote a little program to do it. But they also wanted it running on an Atari 400 with the 8K RAM.
So what was the deal with Parker? Was that they would just publish it, or did they kind of bring you on as an employee? Like what was the?
No.
How
I
did
definitely
it work
was
back then?
It was a licensing agreement, and Parker Brothers were very experienced in licensing products. In fact, every single one of the Parker Brothers games was a licensed product of some kind or another. Whether it's a James Bond or whether it's Frogger licensed from another company. So they did licensing deals for the most part, and I had very good legal representation as a kid, and my lawyer was very adamant about licensing rather than selling the title. I did a deal with Parker Brothers where I gave them the source code to the Atari 800 version that I wrote, and they were in control of all the development of all the other versions, and also including the cartridge versions. All the commercial versions were based on my original source code. I had creative approval to the very end of the game, and I did get royalties on every single version.
Okay.
Which was very nice. It was a good deal, and really the experience overall was it was a very good experience working with people at Parker.
Now, the game originally came out in 1984, correct? When it was finally released, and the Sega Master System release sort of came out several years later, about 4 years later, in 88, 89 or so.
That's right.
So, what was that like to sort of start getting money again from something that probably thought was long since sort of?
I did. I thought we were so done because the game industry crashed, and everyone who was saying, these computer games, I told you it was a fad. You see, it's a fad. It's over. And then, that next generation of games came along, and Sega licensed it from me. back, I guess it was 4 years after, around 1988 or so. And, that was the original Montezuma. That was a very pleasant surprise at that point. And really, even then, I never in a million years thought that, 30 years later, people would remember and talk about the game.
Now, obviously, I'm assuming that the original Atari version that you did would have been your favorite, but of the different ports, including the Sega Master System, which one would you say is your favorite?
Yeah, well, definitely the original prototype is my favorite, with the incomplete boss, and it's most people's favorites. But I'll tell you, I like to pitch the 2600 version because I have tremendous respect the resources of that particular hardware.
Right.
We're talking about sticks and stones, and the fact that they were able to make a playable game that was, that still had the feel of Montezuma on that platform, that blows my mind. They did a great job on that.
Well, I'm going to set it up in the computer museum for our next open house on a 2600. And I'll take some pictures of people playing it and I'll send it to you so
Cool.
that you can see people playing it, 30 years later or whatever it's been now, or the 30 years later. Now you also, 10 years after the Sega Master System version, you did a 3D version as well. Is that correct? Montezuma's Return?
That is correct. Yeah. That was a big flop. That was a difficult time. I had a software development company, in Hoboken, New Jersey. And we had quite a bit of success, in the mid-90s doing coin-operated games. This is, but not, really arcades were already pretty much gone at that point. But this was a game called Countertop Champion, which was a bar top game. Like one of these, they're very popular now. It was one of the first touchscreen, coin-op games. So, like what you see at the bars now, it's really trivia, bowling, pool, like 50-in-1 type game. It's just one of those, it's a genre, I guess you can call it tavern games. It was a very, very popular game at the time. And, we had success in the adult, coin-op games. And at the time, I'm watching technology and I'm seeing what the guys at id were doing with the, 3D graphics, and I always wanted to get into this. Like, this was something, like, I'm watching this and I'm like, this is a technology that I really would love to get into. And in the mid-90s, we created a tremendous 3D graphics engine. I was not the main programmer. I was pretty much the director and much more involved in the business side of the business at that point in my career. But it was a spectacular graphics engine, and I wanted a vehicle to show off the graphics engine more than anything else. The game Montezuma's Return wound up being very much a developer's nightmare. We ran over budget, over time. It was just one of those things where the team was losing morale, and the end product did not in any way resemble the original thoughts behind it. But that particular game has some spectacular technology for the 90s, for the mid-90s, as far as having full freedom 3D graphics. We were doing mirrored surfaces, very, very, very interesting, very, very cool real-time 3D stuff in that game. But cool. Overall, that was the company. That was
so
technologies. Which
fast forward to today.
Yes. Today, as far as me in games, I've always been a software developer, and I love games, but I love other things too. And so the work that I do these days is very much, to me, it's similar to games. It does involve the game of poker. I'm involved in internet gaming technology now. So I cannot go into specifics. I can't really go into details about what I work on now, but it's really incredibly interesting work, and it is very graphical, and it's very, very, very much behind the scenes work of in internet casinos. So I do that now, but Montezuma's Revenge is available for mobile devices and the usual places, the App Store and Google Play. I did that was something a long time coming. I absolutely wanted to, just keep the game alive on the phones, so people can still play it on their mobile devices.
Awesome.
And I also have the Montezuma's Revenge Facebook page that I manage, which is just Montezuma's Revenge.
Did you do that, or did you have someone else do it? There is a story behind the iOS version of Montezuma's Revenge. I was working on. I broke ground on this a while ago, but I've been so busy with my full-time job and the work that I do in other areas. It was taking a long time for me to get the Montezuma game up and going. And sure enough, someone made a really terrific clone of Montezuma's Revenge. And the guy who ran, and it was on the App Store, and someone brought it to my attention, and I checked it out, and it was a really, really good clone. Like, he did a terrific job. I'm working on this, but he's ahead of me, and he's selling it. And the guy who wrote it is a guy from Ukraine, super nice guy. Of course, I wound up doing business with him, and it became the official version of Montezuma's Revenge. So I did. So there was a clone called Montezuma's Resurrection, and the developer of that, his name is Jim Pavlov. Nice.
He totally gave me credit on the clone. Like, he basically said, this is Robert Jaeger's Montezuma's Revenge, my favorite game of all time, a tribute to him, that. But, it's a clone, and he's making money from it, and so I had a chat with him, and we had a very amicable conversation, and we wound up pretty quickly coming to terms, and he and I worked on making the game, more authentic and calling it the proper name and re-releasing it as Montezuma's Revenge. And then I took that code and a whole lot of work turning this into C++, and then for the Android version, I take credit for probably half the code in there myself. That is my own work. The games are they're a little bit different. The Android version, I really need to spend some time and get them to synchronize both releases, because right now the Android version supports all kinds of controllers where the iOS version doesn't yet. But I hope to get some time to put together a nice couple weeks to tune up both versions. The game is doing well. It's one of those things when you have a game that's on the App Store and on Google Play, and it's 4.5 stars. In a way, you're almost afraid to send an update out, because if something goes wrong with the update, people are so vicious and so quick to give you a 0-star review.
Yeah.
Like, it could disturb my beautiful 4.5 stars. So it's like kind of a quandary on people asking all the time, when are you going to actually finish the game? Because I do want to finish the game. It's just that I don't have the damn time. So that's what it really gets down to. I don't have the time. Game development it's time consuming. It's time eating. It's so much more difficult than people outside the business understand.
Right.
And it's not something where you just sit down, okay, finish the game, here it is, half an hour. No, it would probably take a good couple months to really get it down the way I would need to do it.
Well, we know you sold at least one extra copy this week, because one of our listeners just mentioned that they had purchased a copy. So there you go, at least one extra copy.
Oh, because of our Lost Treasure segment on the OMG Hour, one of our listeners went and bought the game on iOS. So
apparently it's the first time that he's actually gone and bought something that we recommend. So I've done over 100 of these. So that's pretty good that generated a sale from him. If he's listened to 100 of these different lost treasures and finally kicked in some money, that's a good thing. Good thing for you, anyways. We're happy to do that.
Absolutely, and I thank that person.
Yes, John, I believe his name is. So thank you, John. Well, Rob, thank you so much for spending some time with us here on Lost Treasures of Gaming. Are you on Twitter? Can people look you up there? Or
Well, I'm on Facebook. I'm definitely a Facebook person, more than a Twitter person. And yeah, you can look me up personally, Robert Jaeger. Montezuma's Revenge Game is the Facebook page for the game. And I'd love for your listeners to join that, and any news, or every once in a while I dig up an old piece of artwork or something and I publish it there. So people that are into the old game should definitely join the Facebook group.
Excellent. Now, I'm looking at your Wikipedia page for Montezuma's Revenge, and they've got your name spelled two different ways. So what is the proper spelling for your last name?
It's Jaeger.
Okay. That's what I thought. And then I saw it differently elsewhere. So there it is, Robert Jaeger. Well, thank you again, Robert, for joining us.
Thanks, Sid.
It's been absolute pleasure speaking to you.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
I love it when our guests can just keep talking, Sid.
Yeah, absolutely. He's very obviously still very passionate about the project, remembers a tremendous amount. It's hard sometimes when we talk to a lot of these guys, their memories fade a little bit because it has been such a long time, but boy, it really it seems like he's either talked about this or just has a great memory. It doesn't matter which, but he's certainly in tune with the past, and seems like he's a little bit surprised people are still talking about the game, but I mean, good for him. And now there's options to play it on other systems, so definitely very, very cool.
For sure. I mean, it was his first original game, and it for the time, I think it was successful. It came around the video game crash, but look at all the different systems it was ported to, and then and it's even available now on iOS. You can go and get it right now. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and it's one of those
I'd love
games
to see it come, as it is, like even get that iOS remake onto PC or something, which I think would be awesome, but I don't know if that's ever going to be a possibility.
Yeah, and it's cool because it's had true lasting power, like a lot of games, they just kind of die off, but it seems like, people are still, maybe in part because of shows like ours, but also because that's the thing. A game can be just in the past. That doesn't make it something worth digging up as a lost treasure. This one certainly is. It's worth spending some time playing, and obviously it's a testament to the fact that it's, survived this long in one form or another. It has sort of come back in a way, and you never know. Maybe we'll have something new for the future. Obviously the story about how it ended up on iOS is interesting. Maybe that developer, who seems to have a little bit more time than Robert, maybe he could actually work on a true sequel that would get Robert's blessing. That would be pretty cool.
Or a PC version. That's all I want.
Yes.
Give me a PC version I can play with my gamepad. That would be awesome. Well, that is it. Thank you again to Robert for joining us. That was fantastic to speak to you. Don't forget, everybody, to check out our partner Fred Rojas's website at gaminghistory101.com. He's the one who helps us pull all the video for our Lost Treasures over at the OMG Hour, and he also does longer versions of Lost Treasures for us of the games we talk about. So check those out at his website, gaminghistory101.com. If you want to follow us on Twitter, this show is at Lost Treasures OG, and I am Ziantane everywhere, and that is XIANTAYNE.
And you said that so silkily, if that's a word.
I have to say it
fashion.
Every week. It's become just part of me now.
You're well practiced. If you're looking for me on Twitter, I'm at Sid Bolton. That's Sid with a Y. And if you want to communicate with us, that old-fashioned way through email, maybe send us a suggestion for a lost treasure you'd like to see us cover, or just send us some comments about the show or anything like that. You can send those to losttreasuresofgaming@gmail.com. And if you want to read the show notes or find out about other shows in our network, just look at the past, maybe listen to some past episodes of this show. There's lots. The shows themselves are actually becoming lost treasures in a sense. You want to head over to omgnexus.com. And also, now, Sean, you've expanded things a little bit and moved things over to YouTube as well. So you can go to bit.ly, that's bit.ly/the OMG Hour. And there you can watch full episodes of the OMG Hour. And you can also watch the video clips of these lost treasures. So if you want to see what they look like and don't want to go through the trouble of downloading them or installing them or finding them, you can do so right there at our YouTube channel.
Yes, absolutely. So that is it for this episode. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And be sure to check out what our next buried classic might be by checking out our weekly The OMG Hour. That's it. We'll be back again next time.
See you soon.
This has been an OMGNexus.com production.